The wind, a raw and relentless beast, claws at Alara's thin dress, biting through the threadbare wool of her shawl. Her hands, chapped and red, instinctively go to the swell of her belly, a silent promise to the life within. Around her, the nascent township of Redemption huddles under a sky the color of lead, its ramshackle buildings offering scant comfort against the encroaching winter. She has so little, yet the sight of a smaller, more desperate shadow, a young mother with hollow eyes and a child whose coughs rack its tiny frame, makes Alara's own needs recede. A trade was intended, her shawl for a meager sack of flour, but the bargain shifts in her heart. This is what she does. This is who she is. Across the muddy track, leaning against a frost-rimed hitching post, Jedediah Stone watches, his face carved from the same granite as the distant, unforgiving peaks. His eyes, the pale, cold blue of a winter sky, miss nothing and judge everything. He sees the exchange, the folly of it, and a muscle tightens in his jaw. Warmth is a currency too precious to squander, and compassion, in his experience, is a fast track to ruin. Well, that's one way to meet. Before these two figure each other out, tell us, what's the most unexpected way you've met someone important? Share your story in the comments, and if you love a surprising romance, hit that like button. The shawl, her last substantial piece of warmth, settles around the other woman's shoulders. A whispered thanks, a fleeting moment of shared humanity in the face of brutal indifference. Alara pulls her own worn coat tighter, a garment more holes than fabric, and turns away, the gnawing hunger a cold knot in her stomach. Jedediah Stone snorted, a small, derisive sound lost in the wind. Another fool. Another lesson the world would teach the hard way. He had his own burdens, his own ranch teetering on the edge, no time or inclination for stray lambs, especially one so clearly marked for shearing by fate. He turned towards the mercantile, his business pressing, the image of the woman's foolish generosity an unwelcome irritant. He had a list of necessities, tools, salt, ammunition, things a man needed to survive, not sentiments that would leave him bare in a blizzard. Hours later, as dusk bled purple and gray across the snow-dusted trail leading out of Redemption, his horse, Bess, shied, her ears flicking nervously. There, crumpled against a shallow drift where the wind had scoured the track bare, little more than a heap of worn fabric, was the woman. One hand was still pressed to her belly, the other outstretched as if reaching for a warmth that wasn't there, her face pale as the new snow. He cursed, a low, savage sound that startled a raven from a nearby skeletal cottonwood. He could ride on. It was not his concern. Scores of people made foolish choices, met harsh ends. The West was littered with them. But the image of her giving away that shawl, the utter, senseless, infuriating generosity of it, stuck in his craw like a burr. It was an act so contrary to the brutal calculus of survival, he lived by that it almost seemed a challenge. He dismounted, his boots crunching on the frozen earth, his shadow falling over her still form. For a moment, he thought she was already gone, another nameless casualty of a hard land. Then, a faint mist of breath near her lips, almost invisible. And then, against every cold instinct he'd honed over a lifetime of disappointment and loss, he growled, "You'll die out here, woman. Damn fool. Come on." His words a rough command that surprised them both. A tiny spark struck against the vast, frozen flint of his heart. He'd hauled her, none too gently, onto Bess, settling her limp form in front of him. She was lighter than he'd expected, like a bundle of sticks wrapped in rags. The ride to his ranch was a grim, silent affair, punctuated only by the rhythmic plod of the horse and the sighing of the wind through the pines that guarded the approach to his isolated valley. Alara remained mostly unconscious, a dead weight against him, occasionally murmuring something incoherent, her breath surprisingly warm against his neck when the wind shifted. Jedediah Stone was not a man given to introspection, but the unwelcome proximity forced a certain awareness. He could feel the slight, firm curve of her belly pressed against his arm, a stark reminder of the child she carried, the reason, perhaps, for her desperate journey, her desperate charity. His ranch was a testament to his nature. Stark, functional, devoid of any softening touch. A sturdy log cabin, a well-built barn, corrals that were strong and secure. No flowers, no porch swing, no sign that life here was anything other than a relentless battle against the elements and misfortune. He'd built it himself, wresting it from the grudging land after. The past was a locked room and he rarely visited. He'd learned long ago that looking back only invited ghosts, and ghosts offered no sustenance. He carried Alara inside the cabin, the sudden warmth of the banked fire making her sigh. The interior was as Spartan as the exterior. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a narrow cot in one corner, and his own wider bunk in another. Skins covered the floor in places, offering some insulation against the chill that seeped up from the packed earth. He laid her on his own bunk. It was closer to the fire, and covered her with a thick wolf pelt. Her skin was like ice. He chafed her hands, his movements rough but efficient, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes as he worked. It wasn't pity. Jedediah Stone had purged pity from his system years ago. Perhaps it was a grudging respect for a creature that, however foolish, possessed a stubborn spark of life. Or perhaps it was simply the ingrained pragmatism of a man who couldn't abide waste, even the waste of a human life, if it could be easily, if inconveniently, prevented. Alara's past was a patchwork of quiet sorrows and small, determined acts of kindness. Orphaned young, she'd learned early to rely on her own resilience. She'd married a good man, a dreamer named Thomas, who'd promised her a small farm in the West, a place where their children could grow strong. But Thomas had a cough that worsened with each passing season, and the dream had withered with him, leaving Alara widowed and with child in a world that had little use for either. She'd been heading towards a distant cousin, a name in a letter, a faint hope of shelter, when winter had caught her in redemption. The small sum of money she'd possessed had dwindled with alarming speed, and the townsfolk, while not overtly cruel, were wary of strangers, especially one in her condition. Her acts of charity were not born of abundance, but of a deep, unshakable empathy. She knew what it was to be cold, to be hungry, to be afraid. Giving what little she had was an affirmation of her own humanity, a refusal to let the harshness of the world extinguish the small flame of compassion within her. The relentless cold of the high plains was an ever-present antagonist, a silent, creeping threat that leached warmth from body and spirit. Starvation was its close companion, and illness a shadow that dogged the heels of the vulnerable. For Alara, her pregnancy amplified these dangers, making every shiver, every pang of hunger, a matter of graver concern. Jedediah, too, felt the pressure of the coming winter. A bad year for his cattle, a lean larder. He was accustomed to hardship, but an extra mouth, especially one that couldn't contribute much labor, was a complication he hadn't sought. His internal resistance to her presence was a constant, low hum beneath his daily chores, a resentment at this disruption to his solitary, ordered existence. The town of Redemption, though small, was a microcosm of societal judgment. When, a few days later, Jedediah had to ride in for supplies he'd foregone, leaving Alara by the fire with strict instructions not to wander, he'd felt the curious, condemning stares. Martha Grigsby, the storekeeper's wife and the town's chief purveyor of gossip, had eyed him with a knowing, pursed-lipped disapproval. "Heard you picked up a stray, Jedediah," she'd said, her voice dripping with insinuation. Some folks got more kindness than sense. Jedediah had merely grunted, his face like stone, refusing to give her the satisfaction of an explanation. But the words had followed him, a reminder of the unwelcome scrutiny his impulsive act had invited. He saw a flicker of the same judgment in the eyes of old Silas Blackwood, the preacher, whose gaze lingered on Jedediah's wagon as if assessing the weight of his new sin. Back at the cabin, the forced proximity bred a unique kind of tension. The small space seemed to shrink around them. Alara, once she regained some strength, was quiet, unobtrusive, her movements careful. She'd try to help, tidying the already sparse cabin, mending a tear in one of his rough wool shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches. Jedediah watched her, his expression unreadable. He'd provided shelter, a roof and a fire, as one might for a snowbound animal. He expected nothing in return, and her small attempts at domesticity were unsettling. He was used to his own company, his own way of doing things. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind, or the brief, gruff words he used to convey necessity. "More wood," he might say, or, "Supper's ready." Alara would nod, her eyes downcast, a faint blush sometimes rising on her cheeks at his curtness. She was afraid of him, he knew, afraid of his moods, his silence, his sheer, unyielding hardness. And perhaps, he thought with a familiar cynicism, afraid he'd turn her out again into the snow. The thought gave him no satisfaction. One morning, Alara awoke to find Jedediah already gone, a pot of thin gruel left warming by the hearth. The cabin felt strangely empty without his brooding presence. She ate slowly, rationing the small portion. Her strength was returning, but the baby felt heavy, a constant reminder of her responsibilities. Looking around the cabin, her gaze fell upon a pile of his clothes in the corner, a pair of worn trousers with a ripped knee, a shirt missing a button. An idea formed. She had a small sewing kit in her meager bundle, a legacy from her mother. Carefully she set to work. Her stitches were small and even, her fingers nimble despite the cold that still seemed to cling to her bones. It wasn't much, but it was something, a way to contribute, to lessen the burden she felt she was. When Jedediah returned hours later, stomping snow from his boots, he stopped short just inside the door. The cabin was tidy, the fire burning brightly, and the repaired clothes were neatly folded on his bunk. He looked at them, then at Alara, who was stirring the contents of a small pot over the fire, a weak broth she'd made from some dried herbs she'd found in her pocket and a little of the leftover gruel. He said nothing, his face expressionless. Alara's heart sank. She'd overstepped. He probably preferred his things as they were, a reflection of his own disregard for comfort. "The stew needs salt," was all he said, moving to the shelf where he kept his supplies. He didn't mention the mending, but later, when he changed his shirt, he put on the one she'd repaired, the one with the newly sewn button. Alara noticed, and a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker of warmth touched her. It wasn't praise, not even acknowledgement, but it wasn't rejection either. Jedediah's initial act of taking her in had been an anomaly, a crack in the frozen facade of his existence. He'd expected her to be gone as soon as the weather broke, or as soon as she was well enough to travel. But the days turned into a week, then two. The snows came in earnest, blanketing the valley, cutting them off from even the tenuous connection to redemption. He found himself in the unwelcome position of guardian, responsible for this quiet, pregnant woman whose foolish charity had landed her at his hearth. Her continued presence, her small, persistent acts of domesticity, began to subtly alter the rhythm of his life. He found clean, mended clothes. The perpetually dusty surfaces of his cabin held a faint sheen. The meals, though still meager, were prepared with a care he hadn't experienced in years, perhaps ever. He didn't soften, not outwardly. His words remained few, his demeanor gruff, but he started leaving a slightly larger portion of food for her. He made sure the woodpile near the cabin was always well stocked, so she wouldn't have to venture far. Small things, almost unconscious adjustments. He told himself it was pragmatism. A sick woman, a starving woman would be more trouble in the long run. But sometimes, when he watched her sitting by the fire, her hands busy with some mending or resting protectively on her swollen belly, her face serene in the flickering light, he felt a strange, unwelcome stirring in his chest, a sensation he hadn't allowed himself to feel since Martha. No, he shut down that thought, quick and brutal. The past was dead. Emotions were a weakness. Alara, for her part, navigated her days with a quiet determination. She knew Jedediah Stone was a hard man, perhaps a bitter one. She saw the lines etched around his eyes, the permanent set of his jaw. She sensed a deep, banked pain in him, though she couldn't guess its source. She didn't try to break through his reserve, didn't pry or chatter. She simply existed, trying to be as little of a burden as possible, offering her quiet acts of service as a form of rent for the shelter he provided. She would save a small piece of her bread for the half-wild cat that sometimes haunted the barn, a creature almost as solitary and wary as Jedediah himself. She found a tattered blanket in her bundle, one she'd been saving, and painstakingly repaired it, adding it to the meager bedding on her cot. When Jedediah came in one evening, chilled to the bone after a long day tracking a stray calf in the high snows, he found an extra blanket, the mended one, laid out on his own bunk. He looked at it, then at Alara, who was carefully stirring a pot of soup, her face averted. A muscle worked in his jaw. "Fool woman," he muttered, but there was no real heat in it. He used the blanket. It was surprisingly warm. The first real test of their fragile cohabitation came during a week-long blizzard that trapped them completely. The wind howled like a banshee, piling snow in monstrous drifts against the cabin walls, plunging the small interior into a perpetual twilight. The world shrank to the four walls of the cabin, the flickering firelight, and the oppressive presence of each other. Jedediah spent hours staring into the flames, his thoughts dark and inaccessible. Alara, her belly increasingly prominent, found her movements restricted. The confinement frayed Jedediah's already thin patience. One afternoon, he found Alara offering a crust of her bread to the barn cat, which had braved the storm to seek shelter near the cabin door. "What in damnation are you doing?" he'd snarled, his voice louder than usual, making her jump. "We're low on flour as it is, and you're feeding vermin." Alara's face paled, but she stood her ground, her hands still resting on the cat's thin back. "It's hungry, Mr. Stone, and it's company." "Company?" He laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "That cat would eat you if you were dead and it was hungry enough. Same as any other creature in this godforsaken land. Sentiment will get you killed." "Perhaps," Alara said softly, her gaze steady on his. "But a life without any sentiment, Mr. Stone, is that truly living?" His eyes narrowed. Her quiet defiance, the unexpected question, pricked at him. He remembered another woman, long ago, who had spoken of sentiment, of kindness. He remembered the pain that had followed. He turned away abruptly. "Just don't waste food we can't spare," he bit out, the anger in his voice warring with a confusion he couldn't name. He didn't forbid her from feeding the cat again, though. And the next day, he found himself leaving a small scrap of dried meat near the barn door, telling himself it was to keep the rats down. The days in the cabin during the blizzard took on a strange, suspended quality. The relentless storm outside forced an unwelcome intimacy within. They developed a silent rhythm. Jedediah would tend the fire, check the cabin for new leaks, and ration their dwindling supplies. Alara would cook, mend, and sometimes, when she thought he wasn't listening, hum softly to herself, old tunes from a life that seemed a world away. He found himself listening to those hums, the melodies unfamiliar yet strangely soothing, a counterpoint to the wind's mournful song. One evening, the oil in the lamp ran low, casting the cabin in deep shadows, lit only by the fire. Alara was trying to read a few worn pages from a book of psalms by the flickering light, her brow furrowed in concentration. Jedediah watched her, a stillness in him. "My mother taught me to read from that book," she said, her voice soft, not quite looking at him. She said words were a comfort, a way to find light in dark places. Jedediah grunted, a non-committal sound. He hadn't touched a book in years. Words, in his experience, were often lies or promises broken. "Did your mother teach you to give away your last shawl in a snowstorm?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. Alara looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was no fear in them now, only a quiet sadness. "She taught me that some things are more important than keeping warm, Mr. Stone, like keeping a soul from freezing." He stared at her, the firelight catching the earnestness in her gaze. He wanted to retort, to tell her it was foolish, dangerous idealism. But the words wouldn't come. He remembered a time when he, too, might have believed such things, before the world had systematically beaten them out of him. He looked away, back into the flames, a familiar ache in his chest. As the blizzard finally subsided, leaving a world transformed, pristine and silent under a blanket of white, a new challenge arose. One of Jedediah's few remaining cows, heavy with calf, had gotten trapped in a snowdrift near the creek. He found her shivering, weak, clearly in distress. He spent hours digging her out, his own strength taxed to the limit in the biting cold. He managed to get her back to the barn, but she was listless, refusing food and water. He knew the signs. He'd likely lose both cow and calf. It was another blow, another turn of misfortune's screw. He came into the cabin, covered in snow and mud, his face grim. Alara took one look at him and knew something was wrong. He told her, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. He expected her to say nothing or offer some useless platitude. Instead, she put on her worn shawl and his own spare, oversized coat. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "I know a little about birthing animals," she said quietly. "My father, he kept a small herd. Sometimes the ewes or the cows, they needed help." He stared at her, a pregnant woman, offering to go out into the freezing barn to tend a dying cow. It was madness. "You'll catch your death. And you're in no condition." "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Stone," she replied, a faint smile touching her lips. "And perhaps two mothers can understand each other." He argued, but there was a quiet persistence about her he was beginning to recognize. Reluctantly, grumbling about foolishness and stubborn women, he led her to the barn. For the next several hours, they worked together in the dim, cold space, lit by a single flickering lantern. Alara, despite her cumbersome belly, moved with a surprising deftness, her voice low and soothing as she spoke to the distressed animal. She showed Jedediah how to massage the cow's flanks, how to encourage her to drink a warm mash Alara had prepared with some of their precious oats and warm water. Jedediah found himself following her instructions, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to a grudging admiration. She seemed to have an instinct for it, a gentle touch, an unyielding patience. He watched her, her face earnest in the lantern light, her hands, though chapped and red, surprisingly capable. He saw not a foolish, helpless woman, but someone with a quiet strength, a core of resilience he hadn't perceived before. Against all his expectations, the cow began to respond. She drank a little of the mash, her breathing eased. By dawn, though still weak, she was on her feet, and a few hours later, with Alara's gentle assistance, she delivered a small, wobbly calf. Jedediah stood by, watching Alara clean the newborn, her movements efficient and tender. He felt a strange sensation, a thawing around the edges of his frozen heart. They had saved the calf and perhaps the cow. Together. "You did good, woman," he said, the words gruff, almost forced. It was the closest he'd come to praise. Alara looked up at him, her face tired but alight with a quiet triumph. "We did good, Mr. Stone," she corrected gently. He merely grunted, but as they walked back to the cabin in the cold morning air, the silence between them felt different, less fraught, touched by a shared, unspoken understanding. He found himself noticing the way the early sun caught the reddish tints in her brown hair, the determined set of her chin. He was still a cold-hearted man, but the ice, perhaps, was no longer quite so thick. The incident with the cow marked a subtle shift in their dynamic. Jedediah's gruffness remained, but it was occasionally tempered by a reluctant respect. He found himself talking to her more, not much, just a comment about the weather or the state of the fences. Alara, sensing the slight thaw, grew a little less timid, though she never presumed on his guarded nature. She learned to read his moods from the set of his shoulders, the tone of his infrequent utterances. She discovered, through a chance remark he let slip about a badly healed break in his arm, that he'd once been a trapper in the high mountains, a life even more solitary and dangerous than his current one. She wondered what had driven him down to the valley, what had carved those deep lines of cynicism around his mouth. One afternoon, while Jedediah was out checking his snares, Alara decided to air out the cabin. She opened the door and the single window, letting the crisp, clean air sweep through. As she was shaking out the wolf pelt from his bunk, a small, worn, leather-bound book fell out from beneath his pillow. It was a collection of poems, the cover soft and cracked with age. Curious, she opened it. The flyleaf bore an inscription. "To my dearest Jedediah, may these words always bring you comfort. With all my love, Martha." Martha. The name struck a chord. She remembered the bitterness in his voice when he'd shut down a thought about a Martha. Her heart ached for him. This cold, hard man had once been loved, had once, perhaps, loved in return. She quickly put the book back, a flush of guilt on her cheeks for her intrusion. But the discovery cast him in a new light. His coldness wasn't innate. It was a shield, built against a pain she could only guess at. Her quiet empathy for him deepened. She understood, in a way, what it was to lose someone you loved, to have your world shattered. The winter wore on, a relentless cycle of snow and thaw, of biting winds and fleeting, pale sunshine. Alara's pregnancy advanced, her belly round and full. Jedediah found himself increasingly aware of her condition, a new, unfamiliar anxiety gnawing at him. He made sure she ate enough, even if it meant his own portions were smaller. He'd surreptitiously clear a path for her to the outhouse after a fresh snowfall. He even, one blustery evening, found himself awkwardly trying to fashion a more comfortable backrest for her chair by the fire, using an old sack stuffed with dried grass. She'd watched him, a small, curious smile playing on her lips, and when he was done, she'd thanked him, her voice soft. He just grunted and turned away, annoyed at his own uncharacteristic solicitude. But he saw her use the backrest, saw the relief it brought her, and a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through him. He was also acutely aware that her time was drawing near. He knew nothing about birthing babies, and the thought filled him with a cold dread that had nothing to do with the weather. Redemption was a day's hard ride away, impossible if another storm hit, or if she went into labor suddenly. He found himself watching her constantly, noting every sigh, every shift in her posture, his gut tightening with a protective instinct that was as bewildering as it was powerful. He was responsible for her, for the child she carried. The weight of that responsibility was immense, far heavier than any physical burden he'd ever borne. The townsfolk of Redemption had not forgotten about the woman at Jedediah Stone's ranch. Scraps of gossip and speculation had circulated all winter, growing with each passing month. When the thaws of early spring finally made the trail to town more passable, the curiosity reached a fever pitch. It was Mrs. Grigsby, predictably, who decided to take matters into her own hands. She, along with Prudence Goodfellow, the preacher's wife, and a couple of other self-appointed guardians of town morality, made the journey out to Jedediah's ranch, ostensibly to offer Christian charity, but clearly intent on investigation and judgment. Jedediah saw them coming from a long way off, a grim procession of bonnets and dark dresses against the pale green of the new grass. His jaw tightened. He'd known this was inevitable. He met them at the door, his stance wide, unyielding. "Ladies," he said, his voice flat, devoid of welcome. "Mr. Stone," Prudence Goodfellow began, her voice prim, "we've come out of concern for the young woman you've been sheltering." And for her condition, her eyes flicked meaningfully towards the cabin, where Alara, alerted by the voices, had appeared in the doorway, her hand resting on her prominent belly. "She's fine," Jedediah said, his voice a low growl. "Fine?" Martha Grigsby's eyebrows shot up. "A woman in her state, alone out here with, well, it's hardly proper, Mr. Stone. The town is talking. It reflects poorly on us all." Alara stepped forward slightly, her chin held high, though Jedediah could see the tremor in her hands. "I am grateful for Mr. Stone's kindness," she said, her voice clear despite its quietness. "He gave me shelter when I had nowhere else to go." "Kindness," Mrs. Grigsby sniffed. "There are names for that kind of kindness, young woman. And for women who find themselves in your predicament, without a husband to claim them." The cruelty of the words hung in the air. Alara flinched, her face paling. Jedediah felt a surge of cold fury, a rage so intense it almost choked him. He took a step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Alara. "Her name is Alara," he said, his voice like the crack of ice. "And she is under my protection. What happens on my land, under my roof, is my business. Not yours. Not the town's." The women gasped, shocked by his directness, his open defiance. "But Mr. Stone," Mrs. Goodfellow stammered, "her soul and the child, it needs to be legitimized. There are ways, perhaps a quick marriage." Jedediah's eyes, cold and hard as agates, met hers. The thought of marriage, of binding himself to anyone, was anathema. But the sight of Alara's distress, the vulnerability in her eyes, the sheer injustice of the women's judgment, it pushed him towards something he would never have contemplated. He didn't answer their suggestion directly. Instead, he said, his voice carrying an absolute finality, "She is welcome here, for as long as she needs, and anyone who tries to harm her or make her unwelcome will answer to me." He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze so fierce, so menacing, that they involuntarily stepped back. "Now, if you'll excuse us, we have work to do." He turned, took Alara's arm gently, and led her back into the cabin, closing the door firmly on their scandalized faces. Inside, Alara was trembling. "Thank you, Jedediah," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She had never used his first name before. He looked down at her, at the tears welling in her eyes, at her hand still clutching his arm. The anger still simmered in him, but beneath it, something else was stirring. A fierce protectiveness, a sense of rightness in what he'd done. He had defended her. He, Jedediah Stone, the cold-hearted recluse. "They had no call to speak to you that way," he said, his voice still rough, but the edge was gone. He released her arm, suddenly awkward. The air in the cabin was charged, thick with unspoken emotions. He'd drawn a line in the sand, not just for the town, but for himself. He had claimed her, in a way, as his responsibility, his concern. The thought was terrifying. And yet, there was a part of him, a long dormant part, that felt a sliver of not satisfaction, perhaps, but of purpose. The visit from the townswomen, however unpleasant, served as a catalyst. The unspoken arrangement between Jedediah and Alara had been forced into the open, challenged, and defended. Jedediah, in standing up for Alara, had inadvertently acknowledged a bond that went deeper than mere shelter. He found himself watching her with a new intensity, a confusing mix of anxiety for her impending labor and a burgeoning tenderness that he fought with every fiber of his being. He was terrified of the responsibility, terrified of the vulnerability she represented, terrified of the emotions she stirred in him. He had built his walls so high for so long, and now they felt porous. Alara, too, felt the shift. Jedediah's defense of her had been a revelation. Beneath the granite exterior, there was a man of fierce loyalty, of unexpected protectiveness. She found herself looking at him differently, seeing not just the gruff recluse, but a man wrestling with his own demons, a man capable of profound, if unspoken, kindness. Her fear of him had long since faded, replaced by a complex mix of gratitude, respect, and a tentative, buganyen-sorta affection. She knew her time was near, and the thought of facing it alone in this wild place was daunting. But Jedediah's presence, once a source of unease, now offered a strange sort of comfort. The days grew warmer, the valley bursting into a riot of wildflowers. But the beauty of the season was overshadowed by a growing tension. Alara was often tired, her movements slow and heavy. Jedediah found himself hovering, a fact that annoyed him immensely. He'd snap at her over small things, then retreat into a brooding silence, angry at himself, angry at the situation. He started sleeping even more lightly, listening for any sound from her cot, his heart pounding at every imagined sign of labor. One evening, as a soft rain pattered on the roof, Alara gave a small cry, her hand flying to her back. Jedediah was on his feet in an instant, his face pale. Is it time?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Alara nodded, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "I think so, Jedediah. The pains, they're starting." A cold dread washed over him. He was alone with her, miles from any help, with a task before him he was utterly unprepared for. For a moment, panic seized him, stark and paralyzing. He looked at Alara, at her pale, determined face, at the trust in her eyes as she looked to him, and something within him shifted. The fear was still there, but beneath it, a deeper, stronger current took hold. The absolute, unshakable need to protect her, to see her through this. His cold heart, the one he had guarded so fiercely for so long, cracked wide open. He moved then, his actions driven by a primal instinct. He helped her to his bunk, the wider, more comfortable one. He built up the fire, his hands surprisingly steady. He remembered snatches of conversations he'd overheard womenfolk discussing births, fragments of old wives' tales, things he'd dismissed as female nonsense at the time. Now he clung to them, trying to piece together some semblance of what he needed to do. "Water?" Alara gasped, her face contorting with a sudden spasm of pain. "And cloths? Clean cloths." He rushed to do her bidding, his usual gruffness replaced by a frantic, focused energy. The cabin, once his solitary fortress, became a stage for the most elemental of human dramas. The hours that followed were a blur of pain, fear, and an astonishing, raw courage. Alara, caught in the relentless tide of labor, clung to Jedediah's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. He wiped her brow, spoke to her in low, soothing tones he hadn't known he possessed, his voice a lifeline in the storm of her suffering. He saw her strength, her incredible endurance, and his admiration for her, already significant, deepened into something akin to awe. There were moments when her courage faltered, when fear threatened to overwhelm her. I can't do this, Jedediah," she cried out, her voice raw with pain and exhaustion. He held her hand tighter, his calloused fingers surprisingly gentle. "Yes, you can, Alara," he said, his voice rough but firm, his gaze locked on hers. "You're the strongest woman I know. You can do this. We'll do this together." And in that moment, as he spoke those words, he knew they were true. It wasn't just her ordeal. It was theirs. Her pain was his pain, her struggle his struggle. The walls around his heart, already cracked, crumbled into dust. What remained was a fierce, protective love. A love he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. A love that was as terrifying as it was undeniable. As dawn painted the sky in pale shades of rose and gold, casting a soft light through the cabin window, Alara gave one final, desperate cry. And then, a new sound filled the small room. The thin, reedy wail of a newborn baby. Jedediah, his hands shaking, his face streaked with sweat and tears he hadn't realized he'd shed, carefully lifted the tiny, slippery infant. A girl, small, perfectly formed, and miraculously alive. He looked from the baby to Alara, her face pale and exhausted, but radiant with a fierce, triumphant joy. "A daughter, Alara," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You have a daughter." He laid the baby, cleaned and wrapped in the softest linen he could find, into Alara's waiting arms. She cradled the child close, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. Jedediah watched them, his heart overflowing with a complex mix of emotions. Relief, exhaustion, and a profound, bone-deep tenderness that was entirely new to him. He had faced death many times in his life, stared it down in the high mountains and on the harsh plains. But he had never witnessed anything as powerful, as awe-inspiring, as the miracle of birth. He sank onto the edge of the bunk, his own body trembling with reaction. Alara reached out a hand, her fingers brushing his. "Thank you, Jedediah," she whispered, her eyes shining. I wouldn't have without you." He couldn't speak, merely nodded, his throat tight. He looked at this woman, this incredible, resilient woman, who had given away her last shawl to a stranger, who had mended his clothes and his spirit, who had faced down societal scorn and the agony of childbirth with unwavering courage. And he looked at the tiny, precious life she held in her arms, a life he had helped bring into the world. The cold, hard shell he had built around himself for so many years had been utterly demolished, washed away in the crucible of that long, desperate night. Later that day, after Alara and the baby, whom she'd named Hope, were sleeping peacefully, Jedediah stepped outside the cabin. The world seemed new, washed clean by the rain and the dawn. The air was fresh, alive with the scent of pine and damp earth. He looked out at his valley, at the mountains that ringed it, the same landscape he had looked at for years with a cold, detached eye. But now it seemed different, imbued with a new significance, a new beauty. It was no longer just his solitary domain. It was their home. He thought of the judgmental women from Redemption, of their narrow, cruel pronouncements. He thought of the word love, a word he had long ago banished from his vocabulary, a word he associated with pain and betrayal. But what he felt now for Alara, for little Hope, it could be nothing else. It was a fierce, protective, all-encompassing love that filled him with a strange mixture of terror and an incredible, soaring joy. A few days later, as Alara was regaining her strength, a lone rider approached the cabin. It was Silas Blackwood, the preacher. Jedediah met him at the door, his expression wary but no longer hostile. "Mr. Stone," the preacher said, his gaze surprisingly gentle. "Mrs. Goodfellow and the others, they told me of their visit, and of your defense of Mrs. Her name is Alara," Jedediah said, his voice quiet but firm. "And this is Hope, our daughter." He stepped aside, allowing the preacher a glimpse of Alara sitting by the fire, the baby nestled in her arms. The preacher's eyes widened slightly, then softened. He removed his hat. "A blessing," he said softly. "A true blessing. Sometimes, Mr. Stone, the Lord works in ways we don't immediately understand. Perhaps the town was too quick to judge." He paused, then added, "Some of the women, Mrs. Albright, Mrs. Peterson, they've put together a small basket. Some things for the child. If you'd permit me to leave it." Jedediah looked at Alara, who nodded, a small, grateful smile on her lips. "We'd be obliged, preacher," Jedediah said. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant, a crack in the wall of the town's disapproval. Perhaps compassion, like the spring thaw, could spread. As the preacher rode away, Jedediah turned back to Alara. She was looking at him, her eyes filled with a deep, unwavering affection that made his heart ache. He walked over to her, knelt down beside her chair, and took her hand, the one not holding the baby. "Alara," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "What those women said about marriage, about legitimizing." She placed a finger on his lips. "It doesn't matter, Jedediah. Not anymore. We have hope. We have each other. That's all the legitimacy we need." He looked into her eyes, saw the truth and strength there, and knew she was right. But he also knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he wanted more. He wanted to bind himself to this woman, not because of societal pressure, but because his life, once so empty and cold, was now inextricably linked with hers, filled with a warmth and purpose he had never thought possible. "Marry me, Alara," he said, the words surprising him as much as they did her. "Not for the town, not for anyone but us, because I can't imagine my life without you. Because you thought a heart I thought was frozen solid." Tears welled in Alara's eyes, spilling onto her cheeks. She smiled, a radiant, joyful smile that lit up the small cabin. "Oh, Jedediah," she whispered, her voice trembling. Yes, I'll marry you." He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that spoke of shared hardship, of unexpected joy, of a love found in the most unlikely of circumstances. The baby stirred in Alara's arms, making a soft cooing sound, a tiny affirmation of their newfound family. He watched Alara later that evening, as she hummed a soft lullaby to hope, her face serene in the lamplight. The cabin, once a symbol of his isolation, now felt like a true home, filled with warmth, with life, with love. He remembered her giving away her last shawl in the biting wind, an act of selfless compassion he had initially scorned. Now he understood. She hadn't just given away warmth. She had embodied it, radiated it, and in doing so, had melted the ice around his own cold heart. The journey had been hard, fraught with peril and prejudice, but they had found their sanctuary, their own redemption, not in a town, but in each other. He reached out and gently touched Hope's tiny hand, then Alara's. The cold-hearted cowboy was gone, and in his place stood a husband, a father, a man who had finally, blessedly, learned to love. The sun dips below the jagged peaks, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and soft violet. Jedediah stands on the porch of the cabin, no longer a stark shelter but a home, watching Alara as she rocks their child. A gentle breeze carries the scent of pine and the distant murmur of the creek. He mended the porch rail last week, and Alara planted a few hardy wildflowers in a tin can by the step, small changes that speak volumes. He thinks of the woman who gave away her warmth to the poor, never knowing she carried enough within her to thaw a frozen soul and build a new life from the ashes of an old one. He feels a contentment so profound it's almost a physical ache. The world is still a hard place, and winter will come again, but now, there is love to meet it. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.